Hello and welcome to another edition. You might even call it the Christmas edition of Mastering Dungeons. I am here. I am Shawn Merwin. I am with Teos Abadia, who is going to lead us through another week of madness and mayhem.
Am I your jolly elf, Shawn?
I think at this point I am more jolly elf-like than you would be, except for the jolly part, and really except for the elf part. Is there like a grumpy gnome as opposed to a jolly elf? Because
I'm pretty jolly. I tell you, I have been eating a lot of cookies.
That's good.
I've been having a lot of eggnog in my Christmas vacation glass. And also I'm pumped because I changed out my furnace for a heat pump. And so see what I did there.
Cool. Yes.
All in the name of environmental stuff because my furnace was dying. So it's super efficient.
I will be
good.
I will be moving there in probably a year with the furnace.
I look forward to it. We're going to play games all the time, pretend we're not married.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, so we should probably do a show since we're here recording this.
Yeah.
And I was going to start the show with actually a question from Twitter. So at Fantasy Realm Guy on Twitter asks this question. Is there still room for new TTRPGs that aren't using a super popular IP? Or even new and original D&D 5e settings? Or is it so flooded that it's simply not worth the work? Any thoughts? And I thought, this is a great discussion question to have with my friend Teos.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, it's a huge question.
Yeah. And I can see where this might come from because I think that there's that feeling that like even Wizards can't cover all of its settings, right? Like it has to dole it out. Or that if you look at the giant Kickstarters, it's things like Avatar, right? Or it's Aliens by Freely. And so I think that I could see why that sort of sticks in one's mind as like, it's like sort of like movies, right? It's just do another, let's do the Matrix again, right? Let's do another thing again instead of doing something new.
Right. Or G.I. Joe or Transformers.
Yeah.
The new stuff that we're getting is sort of more based on the IP than the fact that it's a role-playing game sometimes. So, yeah, I think this is a highly nuanced question because, is there room for them? Absolutely. There's room for anything you want to make as a creator. Is there an audience for them? Most likely. Is that a big enough audience to say that there's a market for them? Probably.
Yeah.
Now, can you make a profit from publishing them? Well, that depends.
Yeah. And I think that's, I think I see where you're going and I like it and I agree in that I think there's room for anything because cool ideas are cool. And so people like cool ideas. And if your idea is in fact cool and can stand out and can grab an audience, it can do really well. Like that, we saw the Planegea that we talked about, right? Like that's probably the most recent case I can think of. That I can probably come up with others where there was a setting that I was like, this take on a primeval world is neat. And it's not just giving me dinosaurs. It's sort of taking classes back to their basics and taking races, back to the basics. Like those are kind of cool ideas. And if you communicate it well and team with the right people and have cool art and all that, you can have a very successful Kickstarter, right?
Yeah. And that's why I think when you're designing a new game or a new 5e setting, whether you're doing it just for fun or whether you're doing it as part of a business project, you always have to stop and ask yourself, why am I doing this? What makes this different? What makes it new? What makes it exciting? Why are players going to have more fun playing this than something that's already out there? Because speaking as a player or a DM, I don't need another Forgotten Realms. I don't need even another Eberron. Definitely don't need another Greyhawk. Those are there. I'm not motivated by nostalgia either, really. So I don't need another version of the Forgotten Realms or another version of Eberron, even with the Eberron name on it. But what I do want, whether I'm creating it or consuming it, is something that provides a unique and tailored play experience that I can't find anywhere else. So I love like the short campaign that has its own adventure plus some rules that go along with it to be different and new, but without making me learn a whole new game.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, when it comes to like an actual RPG, that's again the sort of question of like, well, are you trying to like take on Wizards of the Coast? Probably don't try to do that, right? Don't try to make the next D&D that is exactly what, covers the same bases as D&D.
Yeah.
that's probably a hard market to crack. But we can see some of the brilliant RPG design that's been done recently where there are very unique takes, right? Something like Alice is Missing. It's just completely different from anything we've seen before. That's one approach. But even I think there's some space in properties that aren't so, owned by an entity, but that draw a lot of people. Like I would say something like Cyberpunk. I think there's room there for Cyberpunk systems that allow you to have a certain type of play.
Right.
And you can look at things like that, like how quickly can you play, how easily, how much can you improvise? And along those lines, there's always room for a game that tweaks it a bit and makes it different so that it's more of an experience that people can't quite get, right? Like maybe obviously Shadowrun exists, but Shadowrun is a bulky system.
Right.
So what happens if you make that a much more streamlined improvisational type system? That might be better.
Right. And that comes to a question of, the narrative versus the mechanics, which we will talk about in our news and commentary section in just a moment. But let's dive right into the news. The first bit of news was following up on something we reported last week. D&D has answered some questions with a update to their studio blog. So last week we talked about the Sage Advice and Errata article where there was a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion on all of the changes that were made, not really so much to the mechanics as to the role of certain species in the game and how they are presented. So Ray Winninger, who's in charge of D&D at Wizards, added an update to the blog with 3 main points. And I'm going to let you take the first point.
Yeah. So, and the first thing he does is sort of say, hey, there's been misinformation online. And I kind of agree with that because I've heard people say things like, oh, they just took out so much stuff. And there was a Reddit post that sort of collected all the words that have been removed. And when you look at it that way, it seems like a lot, but there's a lot still there. And so it's some very small percentage of the words that were stripped out. And when you look at some of those words, my reaction was, yeah, these are really bad words. I'm glad to see these gone.
Right.
So I think that was sort of the first thing they addressed, not in the words that I'm using. They sort of said, hey, there's a little misinformation out there.
Yeah.
I invite you to take a look at what we really did. And then he says, and here's why. 3 reasons. One is multiverse. We're increasingly focused on the multiverse. So because of this, Volo's Guide to Monsters needs to speak to all orcs, not a type of orcs that may exist in one setting. And a lot of people looked at this because, Eberron has very different orcs than Forgotten Realms. And he even made a great point later on. So his second point is alignment. And he says, the team feels your character should be whichever alignment you want it to be, so that any suggested alignment for races are therefore removed. Because when we're talking about player facing, you be what you want to be, which is what you're supposed to do anyway, right? So this is kind of in conflict with our design.
Yeah.
And he says, again, multiverse is really important. Like, if we talk about halflings, we might say like, oh, they're generally lawful good, but not on Dark Sun where they're cannibalistic, right?
Right. And even within the Forgotten Realms, the Ten Arrows tribe was originally, portrayed in one way, whereas on the eastern side of Faerun, where the orcs are accepted because they joined the other humanoids in a war, they were integrated into society.
Yeah.
So even within their own world of the Forgotten Realms, that stereotypical orc didn't hold up.
Yeah. And the history of how the orc empires have sort of changed around and who's been in charge of them and all of that. Yeah, so there are a lot of examples there. And his last point is creature personalities. Mind Flayers and Beholders had text suggesting all members had the same personality. This is contrary to D&D's advice to DMs to make adventures and campaigns memorable, which is to populate them with unique and interesting characters. The essential nature is unchanged. A Mind Flayer is eating people's brains generally as a food source. Yeah, that's going to push you towards evil, right? But an individual Mind Flayer can be different. And so, when you paint with a broad brush, you're just undermining what you're trying to do in the game.
Yeah. For example, a Mind Flayer that uses its tentacles to make it look like a mustache and is actually an accountant.
Created such a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this reminds me of the sort of a writing theory in fiction. We talk about flat characters and, in the general entertainment, industry or world, when you hear the term flat character, you instantly think of a negative. You think, oh, those characters aren't three-dimensional. But flat characters are tools in fiction to sort of get a point across without going into too much detail. So if you think of like Robin Hood, you have, Robin Hood is fighting the Sheriff of Nottingham, who is a slightly rounded character, the sheriff, but maybe he has these hench people who are behind him. And in the movie or in the story, Robin Hood, that you don't want to hear the huge backstories of these henchmen. And by actually adding a backstory to them, you're confusing the issue rather than illuminating the issue you're trying to describe. So you'd actually don't want rounded characters in that sense. And I think that's one of the things, I haven't seen it specifically said like this, is in our games, we want those flat characters, those flat foes that we can just put out there to say, these are the people you're fighting. They're the bad guys. The problem is you don't want to make that flat character stereotypical of any species, any races, any religions, any ethnicities, any of that. You want to avoid doing that because that does add a deeper level that confuses the issue rather than illuminates what you're trying to say in your story.
Right.
So to me, that's the whole thing, right? It's taking aside anyone who is really steeped in racism. Mm-hmm. People are saying, but we just want to have orcs that we can fight because we've always been doing that. And it's fine to want that. You're not a bad person for wanting that morally clear, these are the bad folks that we're fighting. It's just you want to do it in a way that doesn't seep into real world isms, which these things have done and continue to do at points.
And I think in a fictional game, which is what we're talking about here, you can achieve this by spending just a little bit of time on what the motives are and what the story is of any group that you're dealing with, right?
Right.
What motivates the bandits? What motivates the ogres? Why are they working for this evil villain? And it doesn't take a lot. And I think probably a lot of designers are going to need, and even home DMs are going to need some practice at it. It's going to take a while, but the reason to do it is because that's what's been happening in the real world for a really long time. And people who don't have the privilege of not seeing it have had to deal with that over and over again. And so I think we've gotten to the point where we recognize this and realize the harm it causes some people, those who see it, because kind of once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yep.
And it becomes a real problem, and it takes away from the fun of the game. And so it's important to start cleaning up those issues. And some of the issues are really jarring and some of them are subtle. If you read some of the text that was removed, I mean, it's kind of surprising that some of that was written in the 5e era. But it's not if you look at what's written in 3rd edition or 2nd edition. Right. And even though there have been exceptions throughout the entire history of the game, there's also a long established history of this sort of problematic language where you just paint with an immensely broad brush and then somehow say, oh, but you can play a Yuan-Ti.
Right, exactly.
You're the good one.
Right. Yeah. It's good. The more they communicate, they being wizards and Ray Winninger in this case, the more they communicate this is why we did it, then it becomes easier to understand it, to see it, and to work with it, as opposed to like Paizo did with the slavery issue, try to finesse it into some tricky narrative reason. Just come out and say slavery's bad. We are removing slavery. And if you do that, then it instantly gets to the point and you can just do what you need to do.
Yeah. And one of our friends was saying this week, don't whitewash it like it's never been a problem, because that's also problematic, right? That makes it seem as if everything's always been fine. There's nothing to see here, but there is something to see here. In fact, one of the important parts is learning the why of it so that you can properly address it at your table. Right. Or in your design. And so I'm glad Ray came back and updated that post. And it almost comes to what we said, last week. It's sort of like, this is written as if everything's always been fine. Yeah. And it is, I think maybe wizards have learned that, like, you need to say why you did the thing you did.
Yep. And speaking of doing the things that people do, that was the horrible segue, but we'll take it. Today is December 20th that we are recording. And apparently D20, December 20th, has been called D20 Day. Okay. And D&D has announced that along with the celebrity game that is running by Deborah Ann Wall, they are going to give away a free Dungeons and Dragons adventure, which is an excerpt from Dragons of Icespire Peak. So what have you learned about this? Because we literally just heard this as we were starting to record.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like a very cool game. It's got Gaten Matarazzo from Stranger Things, Janina Gavankar from Blind Spotting, Melissa Villasenor from Saturday Night Live, Michelle Rodriguez from The Fast and the Furious, who's also in the D&D movie, Reggie Watts from Taskmaster. You know, all these amazing people.
Did you mention Jack Black?
Oh, Jack Black, is he? Yeah. I mean,
I've heard of him.
And that's streaming on, and I think they did this only to make me feel old, but it's streaming on TikTok.
Of course it is. Yeah. Why wouldn't it be?
Sure. So IGN's TikTok channel today has this basically as we're recording. I'm sure there'll be a way to watch it later. It's donating money towards Extra Life. And as part of this, they are releasing something that we talked about in a previous episode, that Wizards is sort of as part of the Magic the Gathering Adventures in the Forgotten Realms D&D card set, had kind of bizarrely commissioned online all these adventures, but then in stores gave away a version of Dragons of Icespire Peak, which I managed to get from my local gaming store because they had a lot of them because they didn't know what to do with them. Yeah. But so you can now get that free online via the link in our show notes. Mm-hmm. And it's part of that old free material page. They've resurrected that. And so they've got, it's a sort of preview and a section of Dragons of Icespire Peak. And then what's really cool is they have these really neat pre-gens that if you played 4th edition, it's a lot like those 4th edition cards that were two-sided.
Yeah.
And so now those are available on PDF for the first time, and you can, use those for your games. They're actually a really neat thing for people who, run one-shots and things like that. Mm-hmm. A fun way to do that. So take a look at that and have some fun with it.
Yeah, those character sheets were super handy. They were usually glossy, and you could use like a dry erase marker on them.
Yes.
So those were great. So hopefully by the time you hear this, the video, the stream will be available for anyone to watch, and that free material will still be there, unless you already have the Dragons of Icespire Peak, in which case you've already got the goods.
Look at those pre-gens.
That's right. And the goods are also coming on August of 2022. The goods in this case being the new Dragonlance book. Del Rey Books has announced the new book, Dragons of Deceit, will be the first in a new trilogy. What's in the book? Teos is going to let us know.
Well, they want to do a sort of reboot-ish approach is what we've always been feeling and hearing. And this is going to be accomplished via time travel and your fan favorite Kender, Tasselhoff Burfoot, along with the device that we saw previously in the novels, the device of time journeying. And that's going to allow the protagonist, who's this new heroine, Destina Rosethorn, to go back in time and prevent things she didn't want to have happen to her during the War of the Lance. But at what cost, Shawn?
At every cost.
Yeah. Did you love these novels growing up? Like, was this a thing for you?
I started reading them right before I got into studying fiction professionally. So the first few books I read, and it was some of the first D&D that I saw in fictional form. I was like, okay, this is cool. This is like D&D. And then as I studied more fiction and then went back and read some of the later novels or reread, I was like, yeah, this isn't my cup of tea at this point in my life. But I cannot say that they weren't creative. I cannot say that, that they didn't capture the imagination of a generation of fantasy fans and role-playing game fans. So, I don't say this to hate on them. It's just at the point in time in my life where I was, these didn't quite fit what I was reading.
Yeah, I think that happened to a number of us. I read them when I first went to college, which has been on my mind a lot since my daughter just got into college. I've been reminiscing a lot and realizing how old I am. But reading this series, I mean, I remember just being in my bunk bed, and just reading through these things and just devouring them, because it was just so cool back then to sort of have very D&D-ish content to eat up. And then I would read something else, often sci-fi, that would just be really better writing and concepts and just so imaginative. But this was always comforting, and it was the mac and cheese of reading, and I still remember it fondly.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, right? It was something very familiar in a format that I wasn't used to reading it, so it was cool and novel in that way.
And I mean, it almost feels like television in some ways, in that it had just these very fun characters and concepts and ideas that we do still think about and laugh about, and or admire, right? Like the idea of these red wizard versus black wizard, and what does it mean to be in the different schools? That's very cool.
Yeah. And then it's funny because Hickman and Weiss put out other novels, non-Dragonlance novels after that I read, and they were super well written and super, just really riveting for me in a way that these weren't. So it wasn't even a knock on their writing style. It was just, this was the way that this story was best delivered, I think. So good on them.
And I'm just going to say really quickly that, and again, I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but the novels were a product of their time, and there are issues in those novels.
Sure.
And one of the questions, especially because there was a little lawsuit that we covered some time ago, the lawsuit had all this language about the new novels having problematic issues.
Right.
So one of the things that I know will happen is there's going to be a lens applied to these books when they drop in August to see whether they are up to the modern era of what we expect out of our stories, or whether they suffer from those problems. And that's going to be an interesting thing to see.
Yeah. Yep. It's just part and parcel with the world that we have inherited and that continues to evolve. So it'll be interesting to check them out in that light as well. Demiplane has some more news. We've heard previously that they are announcing digital tools for Pathfinder and for the World of Darkness games. Well, you can now add Free League to the Nexus. So their third Nexus will add the following Free League games, which utilize the Year Zero engine. That's the Alien RPG, Vaesen, the Nordic horror role-playing game, Forbidden Lands, Mutant Year Zero, and Coriolis, the Third Horizon, with other games to be incorporated in the future. So we now have the third big publisher to join up with Demiplane in their Nexus program.
Wow, that's impressive. And you and I had drinks with Adam Bradford back at Gamehole Con.
Yeah.
And he said to us, there's some big stuff coming. And we're like, yep.
Yeah.
Business people always say that.
Yeah.
He wasn't kidding.
No. When Adam says something, I listen, because, we've all dealt with business folks who are all, all marketing hype and very little follow through. And Adam has a track record of delivering on what he says he's going to.
Adam reminds me of coworkers that I've had over the years that I just always want to work with again.
Yeah.
Because when they say something, it's real. And
So we good on them, and we will continue to keep an eye on whether any more Nexi are announced going into 2022. Now for our minis portion of our show, I will hand this right over to Teos.
Welcome to Minis News. No, I'm not even going to pretend. But online retailer Miniature Market has been purchased at some point earlier this year by Asmodee. And that's interesting news because it hadn't been shared with anybody, except somebody very smart noticed it in a slide presentation that it was just sort of there as a company that they had acquired. Miniature Market is a well-known online retailer. If you buy a lot of miniatures and you can only afford but so many, you probably have to at some point migrate from your favorite local gaming store to a site like Miniature Market. They sell a ton of D&D and WizKids minis. And apparently at some point they were purchased. Asmodee itself is being purchased by a Swedish company, the Embracer Group, for 2.75 billion euros. Okay. And so as part of this presentation they were doing about how everything is just going so swimmingly well, they showcased this as being one of the things that they purchased. They then separately announced that due to how hard things are, they are raising prices on popular board games. So, marketing, yeah. That's how it works.
Exactly. Everything's going great. We are so profitable. Oh yeah, we also have to. Yeah,
we also have to
raise prices, right? Because things are going so great. Okay, but hey, mini news. We've got you covered there. In a 2-part blog, Monte Cook has talked about narrative versus mechanic. So I love this type of blog, these types of discussions. So in this blog, which is currently at 2 parts and will be expanding in 2022, Monte discusses the creation of role-playing games and when there should be mechanics involved versus just letting the narrative drive the action and the results. We could talk about just these articles for probably several episodes of the show.
Yeah.
So we're not going to get into too great a detail about it, but it does provide a lot of great information for creators, but it's also useful just if you're a player, if you're a DM, if you're a fan, to think about games in these terms. You usually just see the end result of the mechanics and the narrative. So looking at it from a before perspective about how the building of the mechanics leads to results, leads to the narrative, leads to the outcomes of play can be important. What did you have any notes or thoughts on it specifically?
I mean, he's been on fire on his blog recently with some really neat thoughts. This is just lovely because it gets, he's looking at it primarily as a creator of RPGs. So when you design an RPG, when should there be a roll, a check, something like that, versus when should you just have the character say what they want to do, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of really good information in this article about that. But also, he looks at this, he shares this story from 3E when he was on the 3E D&D design team, where they would sort of jokingly say that they had a pool of complexity points to use up. And whenever they were thinking of adding some extra mechanic, they'd be like, well, is that worth the extra complexity points? And they weren't nothing they were counting or tracking, but it's just sort of asking that question out loud, a way to say, is this worth mental space you're eating up in a player's brain to do this? And that is a lesson that I think is really important for anybody at any level that's creating. You can be in your home campaign and you're creating an encounter. And if there's too much mental space getting taken up, too many of those complexity points, then the thing will suffer because players will be struggling with it and to understand it. Whether, and so sometimes you got to look at, well, yeah, it's more, the complexity is not worth, it's not worth this complexity because it'll eat it away. So let's strip it down and make it a little more narrative. Yeah.
I mean, there are so many interesting points that he makes and then counterpoints that could lead into bigger discussions. Like the first one that came to my mind was, are you creating mechanics that illuminate play or mechanics that drive play? So in a sense of, if you're just telling a story with your group, then you come to a point where you need to resolve something, then the mechanics are illuminating play. You're resolving the issue and moving on. Whereas some role-playing games, D&D being one of them, the mechanics sort of drive the play because the mechanics are very much on your character sheet and they sometimes push you in certain directions and drive the story rather than illuminating the story. And you need to do that with certain games, especially if you want to sell lots and lots of supplements, because you want all of those stories that you can tell to be driven by the rules as opposed to illuminated by the rules.
It's fascinating. I mean, I can think of, like you can look at some of the changes between, and this is, I think, a question that D&D has to face when it looks at 5.5, right? Because they're talking about sort of advancing the design of the core races. And one of the things I like about the core races, they tend to be pretty light. So there's a lot of things that are really more narrative. And a lot of the later design seems to have a slight increase in the amount of mechanics to it, and especially mechanics that you might track versus that just come up every now and then randomly, right?
Right.
And so things like an AD&D, a dwarf that just knows like how far underground you are. It's not super useful, but it's something that reminds the dwarf player that this is what you're grounded in. And so it's more narrative than anything else, right? And I think today there's this sort of feeling of like, what if I give you a pool of chits to spend, every encounter? Well, that's heavy, right? And it bogs the game down. And so
Right.
it's an important thing to look at of where are those complexity points. And
Yeah. And it's totally fine to make a super complex game because there are players out there who want to play a super complex game. But you just need to be aware of that complexity, what the complexity is doing to the experience of the players. Flanking. It always come back to flanking as it's a very simple rule that adds so much complexity to an encounter just in terms of the time spent in movement that is it worth it? For some people, yes. For some people, no. Part 2, he looks at the purpose of mechanics. So he gives 3 purposes: fun, simulation and believability, and then consensus and order. So he says mechanics should exist for one or more of those reasons. If you can't give at least one reason for a mechanic to be there in terms of fun, simulation, and believability, then that mechanic shouldn't be there. And normally, or usually, you want at least 2 of those purposes to be fulfilled by a mechanic. Otherwise, just let it sit in the narrative space.
Yeah.
And then I can think of some people that are like, if your mechanics aren't already in the narrative space, then you're designing a bad game. So, but that's a whole different kind of game. So, yeah, it's just really, really interesting stuff. And
that's the richness of it. I mean, something like initiative, right? Where we think of different ways that games handle initiative.
Right.
And what does that do to the game to establish that, right?
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. And those are the kind of things that make design so fun.
Yep. So we will keep an eye on future installments of that blog and maybe discuss it even more. It's funny because like I'm reading through the first one. I'm like, this is basically the first day of my college class. Yeah. I mentioned this. Yeah. I mentioned that. I mentioned that. I mentioned that. So, that's how instructive and informative this blog is. It's like taking a class in game design.
Theory. It's a really good series.
Yep. So tell me about this Beastheart from MCDM.
Yeah. So, a little while back, MCDM released a 5e new class called the Illrigger that was all about sort of serving different aspects of sort of a hellish influence. And that had a very creative, imaginative way of being built. And now they've released the Beastheart class. This is not part of their Arcadia magazine, so you buy it separately. It's $15 on the MCDM store. They also have a Fantasy Grounds or Roll20 version, and even some cool miniatures. And the first thing that you kind of see is, okay, there are these companions. It's not like a pet. It's more of a companion. And then you see, my dog just voiced, I don't know if you heard that, but he clearly ready for this. Mm-hmm. But the companions are kind of like you'd expect from MCDM, wild and awesome. They are things like a basilisk, earth elemental, gelatinous cube, giant toad, mimic, owlbear, myconid, which I think they can't say myconid, but it's mushroom dude, and more. And so it's just great. Like they're really fun. The art is unbelievable, and you can use these companions even if you aren't a Beastheart.
Okay.
And the companions have a way of building up ferocity. And that what's really important about these is they're not like in the 5e Ranger subclass where it's like, this is a tame thing that's all under your control. Mm-hmm. The companion builds up ferocity and you can spend it for them. But if you get too high, they'll go wild and just attack everything because they are ultimately a savage creature, right? Okay. And so just the idea of like having a gelatinous cube companion who suddenly engulfs your buddy. It's wonderful.
I want me some of that.
Yeah. And then the Beastheart itself is really well designed and integrates into all those rules. You get a really cool form fillable character sheet. I mean, they're the number of play testers they've had on this and how long they went through the iterations. I'm on their Discord. And so just seeing everything they go through, they work so hard. Lead designer, James Introcaso, kudos to him for a really, really good design.
Excellent. And one more freebie giveaway coming your way. Ghostfire Gaming is providing the first chapter of Fables for free. We've talked about it before, but Fables is a new monthly subscription with each month providing you an 80-page adventure. And there will be 6 of those episodes across 6 months to give you a 480-page adventure by the end of your ride. But Ghostfire Gaming is letting you download the first chapter of episode 1 totally free. You can get it by going to ghostfiregaming.com/fables. If you do subscribe, it's $9.99 a month before the new year, and then it will go up a bit. But for $9.99 for each episode, you're getting a large adventure for basically $50.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And not only is there an adventure, it's digital, but you get some digital tokens and maps and all of the accoutrements that will help you run your game. And my home group just finished Rime of the Frost Maiden, in which I was a player. So it was my turn to DM again, and I took a vote. I gave them tons of options, and they decided to go with Fables. So
Awesome.
I am looking forward to running that in the new year.
Yeah, and I mean, James Hake heading up this project, that's, it's going to be good.
Yep. Great art, great writing, James leading the charge, all good stuff.
Yeah, and if you go to the page, as I did, and you go to get the freebie, it will ask for your email, but then you very quickly can choose to not get to basically not sign up for anything. You can literally just download and take a look, but there is also the option to then be alerted to more news about Fables if you want. So it's a non-invasive, it'll only be there if you want to be reached out to, which I thought was really nice of them to do.
Yep.
Them being the place where you work too.
That's true. So we are now going to talk about our main topic, which is Fizban Treasury of Dragons. We are now up to part 6. Could that possibly be right? I think it is. So last week we reviewed role-playing dragons, and now we're going to try to close out chapter 3 by talking about dragon followers and then how to create dragon encounters, adventures, and campaigns. Whew. So let's do this thing. So with the followers, they talk about the relationship that dragons might have with their followers, or a dragon's role within your campaign. And they give advice like a business owner, Acquisitions Incorporated, dragon
Right.
style. Dragons could be a companion that take on a humanoid form and act as if they were an equal to other humanoids. Could be a crime boss, an emperor, a god, a noble, a parental figure, a patron, a teacher, a warlord bent on conquest. And all these things are fine. You can definitely make a dragon any of those things. They could be 100 other things as well, or any of those things that I just listed. Any creature in the D&D game could be those. You could have a gelatinous cube warlord if you so choose. So it's not exclusive to dragons, but it's a good list for you as a creator of campaigns and adventures to think about NPC types that characters might be interacting with.
Yeah. Yep. Solid advice.
Yep.
The next section is dragons minions. And here it's just really a very short piece that gives you 5 monster features, the kind of thing you might find in a monster stat block that you can add to a creature serving a dragon. So we get explosive minions that when it dies, it releases a burst of energy. And that's the same type of energy as the breath weapon. So if you like your sort of fantastic angle, that's a good way to work. I think it works really well if you presage it ahead of time. Like if you've got kobolds that are sort of glowing red.
Yeah.
And they burst into fire. I mean, that's really fun.
Yes.
But if you don't explain it, it can be jarring. So as usual, try to set these things up. Minion's mind, you can't compel the minion to act in a way that the master would not want. Selfless bodyguard, it can use its reaction to cause an attack to hit itself rather than the dragon. Telepathic minion, the dragon and the minion can communicate telepathically with each other. So,
yep. And I love these. I think that something like this is super important in what I will call right sizing an epic style encounter with a beast like a dragon. Right? If your characters are very powerful and you put the solo monster out there and they, beat it in one round because they all go before it and then they stun it and then they get a second round and it's done before it can even act. Minions can help alleviate that problem. They can make an encounter more, interesting, more fun to play, more memorable. So you could use these types of minion rules with any monster, any boss monster. And I'm going to throw in one for free. Ready?
All right.
Invigorating minion. When a master would start its turn stunned or incapacitated, a minion within 30 feet of the master can choose to die, sacrificing itself to remove that condition from the master, allowing the master to act normally on that turn.
Yeah, that's fun. That's great. Yeah, I
only-
like that
yeah.
because you want to have ways that are sort of a control valve in a boss encounter where you can make it harder or easier. And so giving your minions powers that they can use is neat. It also creates the other thing I really like in a boss fight is to draw attention away from the boss
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
everybody wants to just lock down the boss and use all those terrible powers they have and stun it and all that. And so if your other creatures are important or doing important things like empowering it then or preventing it from, being locked down, then some players will focus on, all right, let me fireball all those minions.
Yeah. One thing I wish they would have said is just minions using the help action. Right? I mean, that's something that they give your boss monster advantage on all the attack rolls by just having a minion help out.
Another one is just, the come on, boss, shake off that effect, make another saving throw. Right, that's a good one to
exactly
add.
Yep. Yeah, and a minion who can wake it up from a sleep or a charm or something. The only thing I wish they would have added here would be how many minions would you suggest for each age level of dragon or each CR, right? Because if you give if you have your 4th level characters fighting a wormling and you give them 30 minions, that's probably too much. Whereas for an ancient dragon, 30 minions might be just about right with all these powers. That would have been good to just a rough estimate.
This whole book has ignored encounter balance.
Yeah.
Right. So it said things like, what if when the dragon dies, it gets to breathe again?
Right.
Well, it's an enormous extra damage source you just added.
Right.
But no mention of that in the text.
Yeah. Yep. So that's sort of it's a thing that could have helped out, I think. And the next section is dragon encounters, and that's what I thought this was going to be. Was here are some tips about running or designing a dragon encounter, and it's really more about storytelling as opposed to the actual mechanics of running the game. The first question of the 4 questions that they tell us to consider when crafting an adventure featuring a dragon is the encounter a goal or an obstacle? And what they say is dragons are usually a climactic encounter, but they can be used otherwise. And maybe I'm not the audience for this particular section, but I'm like, yeah, no kidding. You can use any monster in any type of encounter, climactic or otherwise. And it was confusing to me because the first thing I thought I read, is the encounter a goal or an obstacle? Well, I think every encounter is a goal or an obstacle. Even like a role playing.
I think what they're trying to say is it a goal, meaning the climax of the adventure, or is it a bump along the way, right? So like, are you on the road and you meet a green dragon that swoops in for a meal and that's all this encounter is? Or is this like, ending the green dragon threat, you finally enter its lair or whatever? But I mean, there's 2 sentences here. So it's not a whole lot to consider, but I think that's what they're asking is when you design an encounter, ask yourself whether this is a sort of more random encounter thing along, like, is there just a dragon in it? We've seen some dungeons, especially in old school adventures, where there's just a dragon in a room.
Yeah.
But this is not the villain.
Gotcha.
We keep going past this room. And so depending on that, you design differently, I think is what they're saying.
Yeah. Okay. That makes better sense. So, because the question that I would ask is, how does a dragon best fit into the goal or obstacle that you are setting up within the encounter? Which is sort of what the next question they ask is, what's the goal of the encounter? And as they say, it doesn't have to include combat. It could be a fight, or it could be an escape. It could be, an interaction of some kind. If the goal is just to survive, great. If the goal is to get information out of the dragon, that'd be cool too. You could try to trick it into saying, what it wants. You could try to intimidate it, whatever.
Yeah.
So these are good questions. I was losing the focus on what it has to do with dragons at all.
I think a lot of this chapter and even the previous one, when I read the heading, I thought one thing.
Yeah.
And then reading the text, I'm like, oh, okay, that's what this is about. Okay.
Yeah. So what's the third question?
Is the encounter in a dragon's lair, which is sort of a lot like the other questions. So we're told, and this is sort of strange, we're told a lair fight is usually to the death because the dragon would hunt down adventurers who flee. That kind of contradicts the whole everything doesn't have to be a fight to the death thing that we've said before in this book. But
yeah. And then don't they also say a dragon is less likely to flee its lair? So it, you know, and in the other side of things, the dragon is less likely to flee. So it probably is a fight to the death, which, yeah, it seems to contradict what they say earlier.
Yeah. And I wonder whether this text wasn't sort of, I mean, we've all worked on projects where something had to happen to text, either added or removed or modified. I wonder if something like this happened here, because it just, I don't know, it's a little all over it's a little loose, and I would have liked this to be, I don't know, but I think almost the questions may have been better on their own without supportive text, and then give me more of what I was looking for about how to construct an interesting encounter. Because when I think of a dragon's lair, the things I want to know is how to make a dragon's lair resonate.
Exactly.
I want it to reflect the dragon. I want it to be its own challenge. I want it to tell me something about the dragon. You know, there's so many things that I do when I create a dragon's lair, and you know, there are a number of examples that I've done in the past that, you know, those are the kind of lessons I would have liked to have seen here. And similarly, they say, well, you know, fighting outdoors, dragons can fly out of reach. And that's a whole topic that I think is really important. Like a fight with a dragon that can fly and you can't get to requires a bunch of advice to run well and be fun and interesting.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. What you said earlier was, I read these headings. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm going to get some cool advice on all of these different topics. And it was basically, here are some topics to be aware of, but then they don't give the advice. You know, one thing I would love advice on is what to do when there's that standoff between a party and a dragon, where the dragon is too powerful and doesn't want to fight them, but the characters don't know that, or the characters are sort of being stubborn about it, and they're not willing to leave or give in to what the dragon wants. You know, what's some advice on dealing with situations like that? That I would love to hear, because it's a very hard thing that a lot of DMs run into when they run these dragon encounters, and it just sort of fell a bit short, I feel like, in terms of the real advice to help run encounters with dragons.
Yeah, like, I mean, for that one, this has been on my mind. I forget exactly why, but this came up in some other context. And as part of the discussion, I think it was maybe on Twitter, someone said it shouldn't have a stat block. And I think that's right. It's almost like if there shouldn't be combat, you should pretend there's no stat block. Like, even if there is one, pretend it isn't and run it as if that stat block doesn't exist. Because then you will do things that are narrative, right? You will sweep one of the player characters away with your claw, and they'll hit it, and it just bounces off the scales, and the dragon laughs, and that lets players know. Versus if you start using attacks and whatever, you'll never properly communicate this dragon's too tough for you. They'll just think, oh, I didn't roll well, or I need to do a better spell, or if we lock it down, we'll get it. And that's the worst, right? And that's where those encounters just go sideways. Only when the last character is left standing do they realize, you know, we should have fled.
Now that we're all lying here bleeding and there's one character left at 2 hit points.
In 2 hours.
So, and they also give a 20-item table, dragon encounter complications. What did you think about that?
They're good. I would have liked this sort of thing. I think almost belongs earlier. And maybe it's because, again, I sort of wanted, like, help me build that cool encounter. And these are motivations that I'd use as part of the story. So things like the dragon is desperately trying to find a particular treasure, one or more eggs, perhaps a minion, and kind of bargains for this to protect the thing that it likes or wants. And that's all well and good. But to me, that would be a big part of my design. Up at the very beginning. And then I would forecast that, right? I would show the characters hints of this by having items in my lair that point to this reality that would make them go, wait, why is there this motif going on? You know, why is there a giant nest laid out with nothing in it and books on parenting written in Draconic, right? that's when you realize, right? So like in Acquisitions Inc., right? There's that Deep Crow encounter,
right?
And I literally put books next to the nest that are dating books.
Right.
So if you don't go in guns blazing, you will go, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Is this thing trying to hook up? Maybe it's trying to hook up.
Yep.
Maybe we have options here.
Yeah. I was the same thing with a lot of them. It was like, this is not a dragon encounter complication. This is a huge plot point in the whole campaign, not this little complication. Some of them. Yeah. I mean, some of them are smaller, sort of encounter-based, mechanical complications about, the layer being laid out in a way that you can only navigate it if you can use all of the movement methods of the dragon. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. But I would need to know that beforehand,
right,
to be able to draw the map. Yeah. So it's up to you. Definitely need to use ahead of time.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is it just feels like in this section, I was going to learn how to craft an encounter. And it's telling that the very last piece in the section is literally about the beginning, right? And so we haven't somehow gotten there. And so then, if I haven't seen the rest of the book, I go, cool, I guess that's going to be later on that you really tell me how to do this.
Yep. Hopefully it will be. Next, we get into a section on dragon adventures. We're told that dragons fall into three main roles: a dragon as a monster, a dragon as a schemer, or a dragon as a power. Dragon as monsters, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. They want something, whether it's food or treasure or a secure lair. And because they want that, it is in conflict with what society wants, what the characters want. So we need to stop those attacks. We need to reclaim whatever lair that the dragon has taken. We need to acquire or reacquire the dragon's treasure if the dragon stole it. Yeah, it's totally fine. It's just not anything necessarily groundbreaking that doesn't cover every other monster in the game.
Yeah, I feel like, same thing with Schemer, where it can be, it's got goals and it's using agents to advance its schemes. And then Dragon is Power, that kind of confused me with, it can impact the world as a whole. Okay, doesn't also a schemer or a monster. I think all of this just felt like I could have used. I think these are all good points to make, but they're not super concrete in telling me what to do with them.
Or why a dragon is different than any other kind of creature.
Right, because Xanathar is a great example of a schemer too. And so what's how is it different when it's
you could say vampires, they want food, a secure lair, and treasure. And so you're trying to stop the attacks, reclaim the lair, or reacquire the treasure. They are schemers. They have agents that advance. Right? You could do.
And Barovia, they're a power. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And it's so I wish this had been almost shorter, the way you might expect in one of those young adult books that they do that tell you what is a dragon, sort of simpler at that level, and then give me tools to do to enable this.
Right.
Real how-to versus
more theoretical, conceptual. Yeah. And then the final section are dragon campaigns, where they give us examples from Wizards of the Coast and D&D lore, and Magic lore for that matter. We get Kryn. So in Dragonlance, the campaign is all about Bahamut versus Tiamat. They're called different things, but that's what it is. And Tiamat has the armies of draconians that are created from metallic dragon eggs, and the heroes and villains ride dragons into battle. So, in that campaign, dragons are front and center, both in terms of who the heroes interact with, as well as the larger world-spanning events that take place. What about the Council of Worms, which they discuss?
It's a land governed by ancient worms, representing 88 clans of dragons of all types, and the subjects include humanoid peoples, some of whom serve as aides. It doesn't mention that you, in Council of Worms, play dragons. That's an important part of the campaign. Yeah, and then Takir, Magic the Gathering setting, 5 Dragon Lords rule over Takir. They won the war and claimed dominion over humanoid clans, which now bear the dragons' names. Yeah. I don't know if we want to go. Do you want to go over the rest of this section here? I feel like this whole section. Yeah. All right. Let's go into dragon factions, and then I'll.
Okay. Well, they talk first about campaign events. These events can define a campaign. Then they give examples like the rise and fall of a powerful dragon, a cataclysmic event because of a dragon's rampage, rebellion or revolution against or using dragons, the extinction or depletion of dragons, and then predictions, omens, or prophecies that deal with dragons, like Eberron's Draconic Prophecy. So you can talk about dragon factions.
Yeah, so this is a useful framework to frame your campaign, where you look at how the dragons organize themselves, and how that could be an engine for your campaign. So the metallic orders, the idea that the chromatic dragons could be chaos. The factions are each a type of metallic dragon with distinct motives, like your silver order is chivalric, your brass order is good-hearted scoundrels, and so on. So they're all divided into these camps, and that can be the impetus for your campaign. Or the scaled circles, each family metallic chromatic gem is a faction with opposing goals. They're not necessarily in direct conflict. There might be some overlap. So your chromatic circle may seek wealth and power. Gem seeks knowledge. Metallic seeks to advance civilizations. And so various things that they're doing are running over one or more of the other's desires and creating interesting interactions. Dragon overlords, one for each type, and they demand allegiance from humanoids. A feudal society where dragons fill the aristocracy, and your characters sort of fit in between. This made me think like Shadowrun, where it's like, the megacorps, but they're dragons. Yeah. So right. you're moving in between these dragon overlords, and certainly could be fun.
Yeah. And then there's a section on dragon gods and how using dragon gods can impact the campaign. So they say, for example, instead of the gods of the mythic Odysseys of Theros, sort of the Greek-inspired gods, just plug in dragon types for those gods. So the god of the underworld would be a black Dracolich, instead of sort of Thanatos, Hades type. Yeah, cool. Dragons of myth. We're given ideas for elevating dragons, not quite to the level of gods, or maybe close to the level of gods. So, for example, the artifact of law, if you think about the rod of 7 parts, the rod of law was shattered, and then 7 ancient metallic dragons were guarding the fragments. The city sprang up around these sort of encampments of dragons, and so their role as guardians were pretty much forgotten as civilization sprang up around them.
Awesome concept.
Yeah. You get the cult of the dead god, where the gods slew a divine being, cut its body into pieces, and then fed each piece to a different chromatic dragon, making each of those dragons immortal. And now the cult wants to slay those 5 to bring back the dead god. Interesting concept. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You want to take the next one?
Yeah. Dungeons of Dragons. 15 dragons burrowed deep into the earth and slept. And then elaborate dungeons were formed around them, I guess sort of harnessing that magic. No one has ever reached the final depths of the dragon's sleep. Man, you can do a lot with that idea, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's a lot of fun. Pillars of Creation. 5 ancient metallic dragons make their lairs in the pillars. If all 5 are killed, the world collapses into chaos. Stirrings of Rebirth. When the greatest spiritual leaders die, they rise from the ashes as a dragon egg. None have hatched, but cracks begin to appear in the oldest eggs.
Yeah.
Great concepts, right? These are awesome ideas.
Yeah, these are really cool ideas. And, they're cool in the sense that we know that they're these big overarching ideas. So we don't need to delve into the mechanics of how to make the encounter work, or even the campaign work, because this is more like a world building exercise.
Yeah.
Which is, easier to do theoretically and hard to do when you get into the details. But you can come up with some really awesome ideas, and that's what these are, really fun ideas that you can run with.
Yeah, I thought 99% of this section was just superb. Yeah. And the only little tiny bit that I would say is, if you've read Mike Shea's Lazy DM series, I forget exactly which book it is, but he walks through how to create a campaign. Mm-hmm. And he says, if we wanted to have a campaign that goes to level blah, here's how we could structure it. Mm-hmm. And he just breaks down how the different levels could play out and how the story could advance. And I think that would have been really helpful here. Yeah. If you're going to have a dragon type campaign, what could that look like, right? In
Right.
levels 1 to 4, here's what they're doing. Levels
Yep.
5 to 8, 8 to 12, and so on. And that would be, I think, super helpful for your average DM to just be able to take one of these stories, take an easy one, a simple one, and say, here's what that could look like structure-wise. It wouldn't eat up too much space, but it'd be super, super useful for someone who hasn't maybe created a campaign before.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I didn't think of it in terms of Mike's book, but I thought of it in terms of what I want this chapter to be next time for 6th edition when they write this, is flip this around. Start at the campaign level and say, here are some campaign ideas.
Yes.
And then, all right, now or world ideas. Okay, cool. How do we do a campaign? Just like you said, let's take this first one. We'll do the Pillars of Creation. In a Pillars of Creation world, this is what the campaign looks like. Level 1 to 4, this. And then get down into the encounters. All right, this is going to be your highlight encounter for tier 1. So at 4th level, when you finish tier 1, here's how, give me a full encounter blown up and shown. And now you're showing me, right? You're showing me, not telling me. And that's what we needed in this chapter.
Yep. I love it. Yep. Yeah. Start. And that's better when you start big and go small, because you're inspired by that. And and that's also how you create generally, right? Is that the DM's at home thinking of some wild idea, and she goes, all right, now I've got to break it down to the thing I actually going to run tomorrow.
Yep. How do I get there? Right. Yeah. How do I get there from that idea? So well, hey, somebody out there in the DM's Guild, start a product and do just that. Just give us what the world looks like, how it's different, and give us not even the full adventure, just the outline, and then some highlight encounters in there. And I'd buy that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, cool. Well, next week we're going to get into chapter 4, which is Layers and Hordes. But that is for next time. That is for our New Year's Day podcast. Woo! But until then, if you are a Christmas person, Merry Christmas to you, and Merry Christmas to you, Teos.
Happy holidays. Yeah, everybody. Thanks. This has been my first year. I haven't yet clocked a year, but it's been super fun doing this. I'm super thankful for all of our listeners, for you, Shawn. It's been awesome.
Yeah, same here. Thank you for doing your duty for the D&D world here. And thank you also, as we said, to our listeners and to our patrons. You in the new year can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/MMP. Teos, where can people find you on the interwebs?
Ooh, my latest blog is on alphastream.org, talking about patrons. I broke that down following on what you and I had chatted about. Part 2 will be up this week. On Twitter, you can find me at AlphaStream. How about you, Shawn?
You can find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, or you can follow the podcast's Twitter handle, which is at Mastering DND. Mastering Dungeons is a Misdirected Mark production. So now that we know everything there is to know about dragon campaigns, worlds, and encounters, what are we going to do now?
Run a Beholder campaign.
That makes perfect sense.
No.